Welcome to Do What Matters Most. This is the 14th episode in the series 21st-Century Children. Our children are often faced with confusing messages about what kind of person to be and become. Over time, children can fail to establish a strong and complete sense of identity and remain diffused or living without a sense of wholeness. This makes them much more vulnerable to external persuasion. To compensate for that, the parents of 21st century children need greater skill in helping children form a strong sense of their identity. This episode introduces definitions of identity, characteristics of complete and incomplete identities, and steps parents can take to help children grow into a positive and healthy identity for themselves.
In the world we live in, it shouldn't be surprising to us that there are large numbers of questions concerning the psychological concept of identity. And the reason it shouldn't be surprising to us is that many of the traditional ways that validation occurred so that we felt good about ourselves and understood who we are and what we're like, many of these have disappeared. There's been rapid change that our children have been introduced to. And then there are a lot of conflicted and confusing signs that help kids or make it difficult for them to understand their own experience. This is not just about ideas of who we are by name and by gender and by ethnic background. It has a lot to do with the psychological self in terms of what we think of ourselves and how much we value that and whether or not it's true and so on. And when we lack this sense of identity, then there's a condition called diffusion. And the diffusion means that we're undecided, we're quite confused, and we're not motivated, and we don't know where to go, and we have a hard time establishing plans that are consistent over time. There are currently in the world 33 different gender categories that individuals can take, identifying themselves as one thing or another, or I'm different from this or different from that. And then where there used to be simpler notions, there are many more classifications for what kind of a student, what kind of a neighbor, and we've had to deal with things that are much greater in variation. Now, a lot of this has positive consequences, in my opinion, but the big problem with it is, let's suppose that somewhere along the line, we're not doing in our families things which enable our children to develop a secure and positive sense of identity. And then the consequences for that can include confusion, a lack of direction, no sense of purpose, and often other kinds of emotional problems that accompany that. The purpose of this episode in 21st Century Children has to do with helping us and those who listen to learn some additional ideas about what parents can do to help children develop a positive identity for themselves, one that enables them to give them all the gifts that they need to be successful socially, successful in their own lives, and feel good about who they are and what they are doing. Most importantly is to help them with their decisions about what they do and the nature of their relationships. The word identity may be somewhat vague to you, and in some ways it is not easy to understand. Yet as a practical part of life, we all know many things about it and use this knowledge every day. For example, everyone can be identified by a name, a religion, a nationality, a cultural background, a career or hobby. Someone might say, I am a teacher, I am from Peru, and I am a hard worker. These are examples of identity statements. Identity is made up of the knowledge we possess about ourselves. This self-knowledge exists when we become aware of our inherited abilities and characteristics such as height, weight, and other physical qualities. In addition, we also acquire self-knowledge about ways we act, how we think, and what we feel. A person, for example, could know about her intellectual abilities and emotional style. She could know that she is loved and supported or not loved and supported by others. An identity is formed when this information is first discovered and then integrated in some organized way. When this takes place, the result is fairly permanent. Identity is not a shirt we put on and take off when it is convenient. Identity is the meaning found in the words we use to describe ourselves and others. We talk about identity when we say, I'm a happy person, or she is very loving, or I trust him because he is honest. The biological basis for identity exists in the structure of every brain. It develops and organizes our thoughts and experiences. As we grow and mature, our brains develop increased abilities to organize, synthesize, and then integrate all the small parts together in terms of what we think and how we act when it comes to ourselves. This is natural. All people go through the same process. This is similar to what happens when we put a jigsaw puzzle together. While the pieces are in the box, its identity is a puzzle. Even when we're putting the pieces together, we think of it as a puzzle. But when the very last piece is placed or integrated, we think of it as a picture of some kind. The integration of all the parts has made the puzzle into a new concept or identity. In addition to this natural or biological process we go through, there are many social and emotional conditions which add to it. So, for example, we acquire information by comparing ourselves to other people. This is the method most commonly used by females. We establish our identity by making predictions about ourselves and by saying, okay, I'm going to do such and such. And then if we do it, we say, I am in fact like that. And there are others. Researchers finally tell us that identity is well established, for example, by our achievements, by our quality of relationships, and by our sense of morality, what we believe to be values concerning right and wrong. So when researchers take a look at the identity question for most children, they boil it out in terms of a dimension where it's incomplete or complete. So there are some signs of a complete and incomplete identity, and the reason for talking about this identity formation is to give you some sort of a gauge by which you can take a look at how well your children are doing. If they show signs of incomplete, it'll give you some ideas about what you can do. And if they show signs of a complete identity, then there are some things you can do to add to that. So first of all, let's take a look at incomplete identity formation. Individuals are less productive than they could be. They often are depressed and very anxious. They have unstable relationships, have a hard time maintaining them, in fact. They often have anger and resentment. They assume way too much guilt, and quite often these individuals are emotionally inhibited. When identity formation is more complete, we'll see productivity, behavior of being diligent and able to achieve, a fairly strong, well-developed sense of self-control, of many satisfying relationships, more positive emotions, happiness, cheerfulness, love, and so on. A person accepts responsibility and will actually carry out acts based on responsibility. And then a person with complete identity tends to be a little more assertive. Now, the pressures and routines and involvements in work, church, and relationships can weaken one's sense of identity, which means that the identity concept is not stable. It isn't totally the same all of the time. It can be added to or detracted from based on some of our experiences. But in order to feel confident and secure about what we do, it's necessary to learn maintenance skills which enable us to perpetuate a strong sense of identity. One of these, of course, is a sense of self-control. This is maintained by the awareness that we make choices, and the choices we make and their consequences gives us information about ourselves. Now, when children are very young and elaborated as they mature, the sense of individuality we call identity is more fully realized during the latter parts of adolescence and early adulthood. Identity formation, as the term that is used most common, within human beings is a combination of many things. Among these are the following: goals and the ability to organize to reach them, appropriate understanding of important social roles, self-regulation, which is self-control, and a capacity for fun and enjoyment. Now, these are other qualities or characteristics which individuals with a complete identity tend to display, but these are also ways that parents can promote identity formation. So remember that individuals develop these characteristics at varying rates, but there's some evidence from Montemeyer and Eisen that all development follows some path or some routine. The important point for us is to have some idea about identity and to use it in our families and be thinking about how to promote a secure and a complete sense of identity in our children's lives. So before moving to that, I want to take just a minute and review the importance of identity. First of all, it is the most basic and far-reaching idea in human behavior. It is related to virtually everything we do. Since it is all that we think about when we think about ourselves, it comes into play in virtually every choice, every act, and of course, every relationship. Our religious beliefs, our values, and our work behavior are part of it, and it is motivation for performance and achievement. It is how we express ourselves as married people, parents, and friends. Identity can also be understood from the times when it is incomplete, as I've mentioned, or not fully formed. Consider a child who has received frequent beatings from an overly harsh parent. These beatings take place whenever a parental rule has not been followed or when the parent acts without concern for the child. Since the beatings cause pain, the child begins to be afraid whenever there's concern about parental disapproval. Well, what may happen as this child matures? It is possible that he will be more interested in avoiding the disapproval of others than becoming aware about himself and expressing his identity accurately. This is one of the tragic consequences of any form of abuse. Those victims of abuse actually focus more on how to deal with the threats that other people present, and they don't have the same amount of time and energy to focus on themselves. As I've mentioned, limited self-knowledge prevents us from forming a complete sense of identity. There are several conditions which prevent self-knowledge from emerging, and I want to talk about those. These include excessive dependency between parent and child, emotional neglect of children by parents, early trauma, and enmeshment, which is a condition where a child is not permitted to form a unique sense of individuality. When one of these conditions exists, then a child can grow to be physically mature, but not have a strong sense of identity or a complete sense. One's sense of identity, therefore, is often linked to the idea of autonomy or individuality, where each individual has this current opportunity to be himself or herself, to understand, be asked what he thinks or feels, to have their own qualities or characteristics, hobbies, and so on. Now, most parents do this and allow for it, but often do not take the time to help the child internalize it. And this means, instead of allowing a child to develop a sense of identity just by the events that they participate in, we should include what are called validation discussions so we can help them understand what these things mean. For example, if a child makes a mistake and then thinks he's a failure, he could form that in his identity unless someone comes along and says, well, one mistake does not a life make, and help him understand that things can be corrected. One sense of individuality not only means time alone, but it means that instead of linking ourselves to others by suggesting they cause what we feel or think or do, we need to attribute the cause of what we are to ourselves. This will sound like, I do this because of what I think or feel, or I think this because of what I feel, or I feel this because of what I do. This separating of our thoughts from the acts of other people will remove the false links we establish with others. Maintaining a strong sense of identity is accomplished when we learn to be expressive. That is, to say what we think or feel in many different situations and without blame or condemnation. So one thing a parent can do is to help children learn to avoid criticizing others or blaming them. When we are expressive, for example, without blame, and we feel more positive than when we cannot speak about our own thoughts and feelings. Now imagine yourself going on a date, conversing with parents, talking with a church authority, deciding what to do with a friend, or arguing with a brother or sister. In which of these situations are you most likely to blame someone, or feel that your emotions is caused by someone else, or to see yourself as inhibited by others? Your answer will tell you the situations in which you have the easiest and hardest times maintaining your sense of identity. Periodically, you could invite a child to answer this question, who am I? And then listen to the answer, and he or she will tell you what they currently believe to be true about themselves. A positive identity, for example, is also due to the conditions of one's environment. In other words, your social relationships. These conditions appear to be actual achievement, as I've mentioned, self-awareness, and I've also mentioned previously self-regulation. A person could be said to use abstract thinking, achievements, knowledge about self, and the confidence acquired from self-control to form their own attitudes. An individual who does not achieve, has little self-awareness, or fails to regulate behavior would have difficulty achieving a complete sense of identity. Of interest to us is the unique way we, as individuals, we use abstract thought and integrate this with other things. During late adolescence, it seems the major activity in identity formation is the integrating of several parts of one personality. One person may use achievement more prominently in the way identity is expressed, while another may use relationships or something else. We want them integrated. A young adult, for example, may say, who are you or what are you like? And she might say, well, I'm a junior in high school. And here's what my major is in college. Okay, unless this person's identity also includes things like I'm happy or I love people or I think that's important or my moral values, then their sense of identity will be incomplete. Now, it seems clear that identity depends on the individual finding ways to see relationships between many parts of his or her life. These connections may be similar to recognizing how one thinks or feels about different people or situations, including that I am generally optimistic. I think things are over carefully before I decide. Now, how young adults tend to think about other people is often a reflection in themselves. So a former patient who was 19 began to tell me how over half of the people in his high school were just idiots. And he was a depressed individual, but I said to him, that seems like a rather broad stroke to say half of them are like that. Now, what's interesting about that is that while he had that view, he also did not have a complete identity for himself. We've also learned over the years that anyone wishing to contribute to the formation of their own identity can do so by helping others. Activities, including conversations and decision-making with others, requires a synthesis of personality characteristics and can be used to promote the integration that I'm talking about. Now, are there some developmental stages for the formation of identity? Well, some, and so I'm going to give those to you, but you need to remember that these stages tend to not fit well for human beings. They might do animals, but they don't do for us. So let's start from birth to 3. There are 2 conditions at work, nature and nurture, maturation and environment. They're the same. So it's called an individual status. From the environment, a child learns and relates to a name, acquires knowledge about the world, and begins to adapt to people and the use of objects. What happens biologically or through maturation? The development of senses, physical abilities, the earliest sex role adjustment. They achieve physical skills of eating, toilet training, running, walking, and skipping. All of these are important parts of identity formation. And there is a fairly broad range where kids can be successful with these or not. But if there's an extreme range, then something's the matter. Here comes the next stage. It's called social status. This is age 3 to 7. From the environment or from social situations, individuals learn to adapt to a variety of social situations, and this promotes self-knowledge in fairly concrete ways. I can run fast. I am big. These self-references are used as explanations for social status. Well, what about biology? Well, a child begins to use physical abilities as a primary way of relating to other people. Social status, for example, is often based on how skillful or unskillful a child is, or how pretty, or the lack of attractiveness. Here's the next one. It's called achievement, ages 7 through 12. From the social environment, children develop levels of achievement motivation and use them for various tasks. These may include academic work, specialized talents, and/or chores at home. The ability to utilize self-regulation in order to perform these talents or enhance them comes into play, in order to balance achievement and activities with other experiences. Achievement becomes more specialized, and individuals begin to better recognize what they might successfully achieve. It's also true that the basis for status socially changes, and children during this period of time tend to have longer-term friendships where they like each other for personality qualities that they know about each other. And then the stage, which usually includes identity formation, this is ages 13 to older. This is when things, separate events and experiences in life become integrated. And so that's why it's called identity formation stage. Identity, as we know, actually continues throughout life. So here's the social environment. Increased social involvement promotes more awareness and self-consciousness. A child who isolates himself typically will have difficulty in forming his own identity. Achievements can be recognized by important groups and used to achieve status. Belonging matters a lot here, and belonging to people who have similar values matters a lot. Well, what about maturation, or the biology of identity? Children show an improved ability to think abstractly, that's mental growth, which permits them to perceive relationships among their own personality traits. I do this and I also do that, and gee, I'm this kind of person, and therefore I probably am an outgoing, kind person, or no, I'm an introvert. These connections are formed into the generalized beliefs that make up the concept of identity. Now, what does all this mean? In my opinion, this is sort of a warning shot that the conditions 21st century children are in actually do less to promote a strong sense of identity than some of the more stable conditions that existed in previous generations. There's also an opportunity, however, for us to use a greater variety of experiences to help our children, but that's the key, helping our children. Making our children's identity formation as boys and girls, as people who can accomplish different things, who have different talents, is crucial to their success. I hope that as parents, you will begin to identify a new set of tools because our children in this generation need it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Do What Matters Most, which is sponsored by firstanswers.com, where you can find new tools for families and parents of 21st century kids with a focus on emotional self-reliance. Visit firstanswers.com to sign up for a free newsletter. Find Do What Matters Most on Facebook and our website, mattersmostmedia.org, where you can ask Dr. Scoresby your own questions. Remember to subscribe to stay up to date with new episodes. Give us a rating and write a review on the podcast app or Google Podcasts, and let us know what you think about Do What Matters Most.